I thought I'd talk a little bit about the Pony Express because this is the 150th anniversary this month of its brief career. The firm was actually called the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, and that name was so unwieldy that they couldn't put it on anything. So they called it simply the Pony Express. The Pony Express is among the most enduring and endearing memories that we have of the 19th century West. People who do not speak a word of English can tell you what Pony Express means. In fact, in Czechoslovakia, which is a long way from the Wild West, there are Pony Express clubs where people dress up as the Marlboro Man and reenact the brief career of the Pony Express. It occurred to me after I wrote this book for Random House that I could have actually made a great deal more money betting people in bars how long the Pony Express was in business, because they never got it right, and that cheers me immeasurably. So after you leave here this afternoon, you can go out and try this yourself. The Pony Express was only in business for 78 weeks. April 3rd, 1860 to October 24th is the accepted date in 1861. A year and a half. It hemorrhaged money from the day it began, never made a dime. But in memory, it is a colossus, and Americans love that memory. So the story of the Pony Express is really the story of how something got to be a story. An American tall tale, a kind of whopper. This is a bit like a fishing story. And the Pony Express, the fish just gets a little bigger every year. Now it's a rather big fish. So why is that possible? People often ask me, they'll say, how is it that we remember the Pony Express the way we do? We do because of two Americans who saved the memory of the Pony Express for us, though it lasted only 78 weeks. The first of these was a 26-year-old Confederate Army deserter who was going west in a Concord coach. He had served in the Confederate Army for 2 weeks, fearing he might see a Union soldier. And he was sitting on the top of a stagecoach because the stagecoach driver told him that if he was observant, they might see the Pony Express rider flash by the coach, and they did. He called that rider the Swift Phantom of the Desert, and writing entirely from memory in Hartford, Connecticut, 10 years later, having not taken a single note, Mark Twain got a whole chapter of roughing it out of that encounter, which shows you what you can do if you're Mark Twain with your material. When Mark Twain got done, no one would worry about the Pony Express being a colossal failure and a financial disaster that sent one of its backers to jail. They would think of it only as among the most romantic memories of the Old West. I recommend Twain's description of the rider to you. It's incredibly vivid, and although he doesn't let the facts get in the way of the story, he does tell us a lot about how the Pony Express operated. The other American who came along 1 decade after Mark Twain, who absolutely saved the memory of the Pony Express for us, was William Frederick Cody, Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill put the Pony Express in his show. Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the World was the name of the show. It was a little skit. They would reenact the Pony Express. And from the day Buffalo Bill's show opened in Omaha, Nebraska in the spring of 1881 until the day it went out of business in 1916, when Cody was an old man, broke and sick, and he couldn't even get on the back of a horse. They used to have to hoist him up so he could wave to the fans. Drunk or broke, in sickness or in health, wherever he went, he took the Pony Express with him as part of his show. It was a permanent fixture of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Queen Victoria came out of mourning to see the Pony Express. And the Pope allowed the Pony Express to ride around Vatican City. An extraordinary thing. When Bill Cody got done, no one would forget the Pony Express, and some of you may know what I mean by the expression branding. Bill Cody branded the memory of the Pony Express on European and American spectators, and from Baraboo, Wisconsin to Lewiston, Maine, and from Goshen, Indiana to Gloucester, Massachusetts, wherever they took the Wild West show, people saw the Pony Express. They replaced many of the other acts, but that was a permanent, irreplaceable fixture, and it went a long way toward helping Americans remember the Pony Express. Buffalo Bill was also someone who was not unfamiliar with the matter of not letting the facts get in the way of a good story. In his case, one of the things that he remembered was he would come to remember that he had ridden for the Pony Express. He remembered a lot about that, and that he didn't in fact ever ride for the Pony Express, but you will see books printed to this day by major American publishing houses that credit Bill Cody as a rider of the Pony Express. But my affections for Buffalo Bill are very great. He was actually a very decent American fellow and a very kind man. He didn't in fact kill that many buffalo, and he was actually very fond of Indians, and Indians liked Buffalo Bill. But Buffalo Bill enriched his CV, as you might say. And as he got older, his stories became more amazing. After he died, one of his sisters, Helen Wetmore Cody, wrote a book about him. Unfortunately, he hadn't anticipated that his sisters would outlive him, and they did, and they always said, though they were very fond of him, "Oh, Billy never did those things at all." So Mark Twain and Buffalo Bill helped America remember the Pony Express. It's interesting that we're at the National Postal Museum, because and I am grateful to the National Postal Museum. This is the second time I've visited them over the years. But the Pony Express had nothing to do with the United States Postal Service, which often surprises people. The United States Postal Service has the same sort of memory Buffalo Bill had. They now remember that the Pony Express had some connection with them, but the Pony Express was a privately financed venture owned by Russell, Majors, and Waddell. They were the great freight haulers of the American West in the 1850s, fabulously successful. And they bankrolled this as a kind of madcap scheme. And I'll tell you a little about that, assuming that you don't know too much about how it operated. The Pony Express began in St. Joseph, Missouri, which is where the railroad and the telegraph line ended in 1860. Now, this is before the American Civil War. And the line ended in Sacramento, California, roughly 2,000 miles. Purists like to say 1,966 miles, but we're not talking about the New Jersey Turnpike, so the route is a little vague and a little amorphous. You could get lost out there. The idea was to move a piece of mail across the country in 10 days' time or less on the back of a fast horse with a light rider, a rider built like a jockey, often a boy. And they did that. They succeeded in doing what they set out to do, but they never made a nickel doing that. In part, it had to do with this. In order to make this system work, you needed to change horses every 10 miles. And you needed to change riders every 100 miles. So if any of you know anything about business, this would be the kind of thing that you could teach at Wharton or Harvard as how not to run a business. For the business literally hemorrhaged money in crazy ways. It was impossible for that rider to carry enough mail. And it cost $5 to send a letter across America. And to give you some perspective, in 1860, $5 was a week's wages for a worker in Kansas. So this was an expensive proposition. They also didn't carry anything that was heavy, the object being to keep that mail moving. Now, if you think about it, in 10 days' time or less, I'm sure your math is better than mine is, but that's 240 hours. And you don't need to be riding very fast to move mail across America in 10 days' time or less. You just have to keep the mail moving. After Buffalo Bill and Mark Twain came along, perhaps the Americans who also helped us remember the Pony Express were a legion of illustrators. Frederick Remington was the most famous of these, and an army of guys who wished they were Frederick Remington. And none of those images, or virtually none of those images, are in fact accurate. Some of them are preposterous, all painted by guys who had never seen the Pony Express. My favorite is a French illustration painted in Paris by a man who never saw the Pony Express that shows a guy on the back of a horse with a thing that looks like Davy Crockett's hat on his head, but or a whole fox. And he's riding with a bag of mail over his shoulder like Santa Claus, which is an extraordinary thing. The actual mail sat in something called a mochila, which is a sort of border Spanish for saddlebag or knapsack, and that sat over the saddle. And when a rider came into a station, they changed horses and they moved the mochila onto a fresh horse. And this could be done in literally in seconds. The actual movement of the mail across the country was extraordinary. Another thing Americans often find interesting about this is you've probably seen countless illustrations of the Pony Express rider, and if you doubt me, go home and go on the internet, being chased by red savages, as they would have been called in the 19th century. There is absolutely no evidence that the American Indian had any interest in the Pony Express, really. You might ask yourself, why would a Paiute Indian want a 3-week-old copy of the New York Tribune? There was nothing the Pony Express carried that was of any interest to the Indians. But in the memory of illustrators, there were always 100 Indians running after the Pony Express rider, and he's shooting at them too. You've probably seen that illustration as well. The firm did not issue firearms. And I love this because occasionally people call me and they say, about a year ago, somebody called me. I don't like to get involved in these things, so I usually say, no thanks. But somebody called me and they said, they're auctioning off Buffalo Bill's Pony Express pistol in Pennsylvania. And first of all, Bill never rode for the Pony, and the Pony didn't issue pistols. I said to them, how is it that you know this is Buffalo Bill's Pony Express pistol? They said, well, it says right on the pistol, Buffalo Bill's Pony Express pistol. Someone bought that pistol, but I had no hand in the transaction at all. The other thing that Americans often find interesting at the beginning of the 21st century is the relationship the memory of the Pony Express had with film. Millions of American filmmakers from the days of silent film loved the Pony Express. No one loved the Pony Express any more than the great American filmmaker John Ford, who made some of the great westerns, including the classic The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which ends, some of you may know, with the famous line, "This is the West, sir, and when the legend is better than the fact, we print the legend." He understood that entirely. Yes, the truth, yes. John Ford's film Fort Apache, one of my favorites, begins with the rider of the Pony Express galloping in to Fort Apache to bring the news of Custer's last stand to the beleaguered men at Fort Apache. What is wrong with that? Custer was killed on the Little Bighorn in June of '76, 15 years after the Pony Express went out of business. And the Pony Express never went anywhere near Arizona. But that doesn't bother a soul. So what enchanted me about the story of the Pony Express was that it was, in fact, a kind of American whopper, and Americans love a story like that. The facts are hard to figure. I'll say a little about that. The firm kept no records. There is no discernible archive of Pony Express arcana. People who knew more about this than I did believed that it was probably because they had so many financial problems that they didn't want to keep any records, or what records they had, they probably destroyed. And also, need I remind you, they were so briefly in business that it really didn't matter. And also, the American Civil War was going on. One thing that people often find interesting about the Pony Express is that part of the way it got to be a kind of American tall tale has to do with how we chose to remember it. I told you a little about Buffalo Bill and Mark Twain, but the first book-length work on the Pony Express was not written until nearly half a century after the Pony Express ran. And that was the work of a guy who called himself Colonel William Lightfoot Vischer. He was not a colonel, but that's another story. He was an alcoholic newspaper man who roamed the West. He occasionally worked as a temperance lecturer when he wasn't drunk. And the colonel, his legal address was the bar of the Chicago Press Club. He did all his research there, too. And when the colonel got done, no one could be entirely sure what was true. He called the book A Thrilling and Truthful History of the Pony Express and Other Incidents of Those Stirring Times as a subtitle to it. It was published in 1908, and it set a standard for confusion that you will find on the internet this afternoon, and I'm okay with that too. Part of that is that once Colonel Vischer wrote his book, everybody who wrote a book after him kind of piggybacked on things. No one had written much down. An early attempt to write a serious history of the Pony Express by a man named William Floyd, who was an actual resident of St. Joseph, Missouri, he threw his hands up and he said, "It's a tale of truth, of half-truth, and of no truth at all." And that was the story of the Pony Express as far as he was concerned. There were, over time, absolutely wonderful characters associated with the Pony Express, and they are, in fact, part and parcel of this book. But we also have some actual facts about the Pony Express, for the Pony Express actually did operate. One of the people who tells us some facts about it is the British explorer Richard Burton, and that is not Elizabeth Taylor's husband. This would be the earlier Richard Burton. I point that out for older members of the audience. Richard Burton had some problems with women in London, and he decided that a bracing adventure in the American West would be good for him. So he went out west. He was out there for 100 days. He was an obsessive-compulsive taker of notes, and he wrote down every single thing he saw. He wrote down descriptions of how Indians scalp people. He wrote down all sorts of wild stuff. But Burton saw the Pony Express, and it is because of Burton. His book is called To the City of the Saints, and it is still in print. It's a wild account of the West at a time when the West was wild. Burton tells us a tremendous amount of interesting stuff about the Pony Express. He tells us that horses, and they spent a fortune buying good horses, were so valuable in Nevada and Utah, which is like a lunar landscape, if you know it at all. Between Salt Lake and the Pacific Slope, there is nothing green at all. It's like riding across the moon. And it was even worse then because the Paiute Indians were on the warpath. Burton tells us that they brought the horse into the station at night and made the men sleep outside under the wagon because the horse was valuable. You could always get another man, but you couldn't get a good horse. And the horses were enormously valuable and enormously expensive. And if you know anything about horses, these horses had to be grained, fed well, they had to have water. They were a lot of work. So it would take very little time for you to figure out that the whole thing was a kind of madcap idea. And the backers of it were hoping that the government would give them what would be the equivalent of federal mail contracts. That never happened. The Civil War was going on. They had a lot of problems. And then one day, in October of 1861, the Creighton brothers, Edward and Long John Creighton, there's a couple of tough Irishmen, punched through the transcontinental telegraph like that. And it put the Pony Express out of business in one day. People thought it would take years to string telegraph line across America. And the Creighton brothers told their employees they did it between July and October of 1861, 120-something days. They said, you don't want to be out here when it gets cold. And that may have inspired the men to work harder. But that was the end of the Pony Express. The newspapers in California published these wonderful encomiums. Our little friend, the pony, will run no more, said the Sacramento Bee. And that was the end of the Pony Express. And it was the end until Colonel Vischer would come along half a century later and start remembering things, whether they happened or not. When I set out to do this book, I found many Americans in the American West today who said their great-great-great-grandfathers had ridden for the Pony Express. I met so many people whose great-great-great-grandfathers had ridden for the Pony Express that it occurred to me that they would not have had to use a horse. They could have lined everyone up and passed the mail back and forth by hand. There were that many people. That's a very American memory. I've met countless people. Between St. Joe and Sacramento, California, the Pony Express touched 8 states. From Missouri, it went into Kansas, then Nebraska, clipped a corner of Colorado, back into Nebraska, crossed Wyoming, the South Pass, and then down into Salt Lake City, where the Mormons were, crossed this lunar landscape of Utah and Nevada, and then over the Sierra Nevadas and down into Sacramento, California. We have, in lieu of a formal history written by the owners of the company, we have wonderful memories of people who in fact saw the Pony Express. And I tell you a couple of things about that and let you perhaps ask a question or two. One day I was in Topeka, Kansas when I was researching this book. No one had written a book about the Pony Express in 50 years when I wrote Orphans Preferred. And it occurred to me fairly quickly that really what the story of the Pony Express was how it got to be a story. So I was in Topeka, Kansas, and I was rooting through the old library cards. Remember those yellowed library cards when you used to have a card catalog? Yes, some of you know those things. I'm rooting through those things, and I see one, and it refers to a kind of deposition taken by one of these people during the WPA when they used to go around interviewing people about this and that. And it was an interview with an old gal named Lizzie Traveloot, who was a teacher out on the prairie in Kansas. She lived a life out of a Willa Cather novel, right out of My Antonia. And I looked at that card and I turned it over, and on the back of the card it said, she saw the rider of the Pony Express. I thought, amazing. Well, I went to see her kin, and I asked to see the deposition, which was this spidery thing about 5 pages long that someone had carefully typed up on that sort of onion skin paper that they used to use back in the day. And here was an old gal. This wasn't some bar story at the Chicago Press Club. Here was an old gal who actually had seen the rider of the Pony Express and had thought to tell us something about it. It was astounding. She was in Marysville, Kansas. That's the first stop on the line out of St. Joe. Exactly 100 miles from St. Joe, straight as a line, is Marysville, the first home station. And on the way there, you pass through Home, Kansas, where the sign says, there's no place like home. And I believe that might have been the inspiration for Frank Baum, but I could be mistaken, but I don't think so. In any rate, she was in Marysville when Richard Burton rode through town on his way west, and she was in Marysville the day that Mark Twain went through town. And she lived until 1939, and she remembered. So there were lots of people like that. And some of them, they weren't all liars and rascals and drunks, but some were. My favorite was a man named Bronco Charlie Miller. I end the book with Bronco Charlie. He was a professional horse thief and a pathologic liar who convinced people he was the last rider of the Pony Express. I can tell you, if you look at the American newspaper archives in the West, newspapers in Nevada and Wyoming printed obituaries of the last rider of the Pony Express for decades. It's a fixture. It's because we can search things now because of digital search engines. It's astounding how many people claim to be the last rider of the Pony Express. Basically, from about the time of the First World War until nearly the Second World War, somebody who was the last rider of the Pony Express was dying every week. Why? They couldn't keep track of the number of these guys. The state of Nevada was particularly full of people who had seen things that they might not have seen. As an old man, I talked to an old man in Julesburg, Colorado, named August Borklin. He's a saddle maker there. He's a member of the National Pony Express Association, which keeps the memory of the Pony Express alive. And I said to him, Mr. Borklin, I've been researching the story of the Pony Express. And I find that it's full of whoppers, and some of these things, these books, they don't appear to be true. I'm very confused. And he said to me, Mr. Corbett, we do not lie out here. We remember big. And that, in fact, is the story of the Pony Express, the story of remembering big. I find it's more helpful if I just chat with you a little about it, but I'm delighted to answer questions, if you have any questions. Or I can continue to tell you some stories about the Pony Express as well, but perhaps if somebody has a question or two. Please, sir, yes?
Do we know the names of any of the writers? And
We do.
Do you have any idea of exactly how many there were?
We do. Alexander Majors, who owned the company, who wrote a biography called 70 Years on the Frontier. Alexander Majors is a fascinating guy. He's in the book. He was one of the owners, Russell, Majors, and Waddell. He opened the Santa Fe Trail. When Alexander Majors was a young man on the Santa Fe Trail, he saw this French-Canadian long-distance rider named Francis Xavier Aubry. This guy would ride from Santa Fe to Independence, Missouri, not on the same horse, that had killed the horse, but by, and when he saw that, he thought, and people had done this before, he thought that they could use long riders, what they called people who would ride tremendous distances, carrying messages. Genghis Khan is said to have done this. Americans are often surprised to find that news that the British had been fired upon at Lexington and Concord reached Hartford, Connecticut by noon of that day and was in New York City that evening. That's how fast a good rider can cover good ground if you change horses regularly. You don't have to kill the horse, you just have to keep moving. In fact, you cannot really ride a horse like that hard more than fairly short distances. One thing that people often find too with the images of the Pony Express is that the horses are always galloping, but in fact what records we have of interviews with actual people, and I'll say something about that, who rode for the Pony Express, they in fact say they didn't gallop that much. In fact, they were riding day and night in all kinds of weather, and it was dangerous. You could hurt the horse. Then you'd have to walk. The instructions were, if anything happened, walk in with the mail on your back. So, yes, we do know some. There are half a dozen or more lists of people who are believed to have ridden for the Pony Express, and many of them, in fact, did ride for the Pony Express. But it was not the space program. It was strung out across this 2,000-mile route, and it was largely almost a kind of volunteer basis. A young man or a boy who was light in the saddle, the important thing being to put a light person on the back of a good horse, could be, asked to ride. You didn't train for years to do this. The whole thing was thrown together in a matter of a few months. They piggybacked on the existing Oregon Trail stations, and then after Salt Lake City, they pretty much did whatever they needed to do. We do know the names of people. In about the time of the First World War, an old gal named Mabel Loving, she was a housewife and an amateur poetess, as they used to say, in St. Joseph, Missouri, did something no one else thought to do. She wrote letters to the people who had actually ridden for the Pony Express, and there were some of them alive. One of them was an old Irishman who lived in Washington, D.C., named McInerney. Anyway, she wrote them letters, and they wrote back to her. And they told her really interesting stuff. And her book, self-published, really crazy book, really disorganized. They only printed 100 copies. I own one of them, and they're extremely hard to get. Mrs. Loving saved the memory of the Pony Express for Americans because these were people who had actually done this. They weren't making these tales up. One of my favorites was a guy. He was a rancher in Montana, and he wrote to her. He didn't write back right away, and then he apologized in his letter, and he said, I'm sorry, I've been busy on the ranch. I had to move a herd. We had to go up to Alberta and all this stuff. Then you realize he's 78 years old, and he's still in the saddle. These were hard people, tough. You had to be very tough to do this. In St. Joe, interestingly, we do not know for a fact who the first rider of the Pony Express was. People say that the editor of the newspaper in St. Joe got so excited that he ran back to the paper without writing down the name of who the first rider was. So there's an enormous dispute in St. Joe. In fact, Over the 150 years since the Pony Express operated, they've had investigations into it, and no one can entirely agree on who that first man was on the back of the horse. They all agree, though, that the horse was black. But then they also argue, some say, well, the horse might have been a paint, or it might have been a pinto, or whatever. But yeah, it's that kind of story. One of my favorite images of the memory of the Pony Express is an oil painting, and it was commissioned by a brewery in St. Joseph, Missouri, long after the Pony Express ran, and it hangs in a big bank in St. Joe to this day. And it shows the first ride of the Pony Express, April 3rd, 1860. Beautiful blue sky, the sun is shining, a huge crowd of people on hand, a German band playing, it's like a symphony orchestra, the riders in the saddle galloping, ladies are waving their parasols, and men have their, it's a fabulous painting of the, now, I always wondered about that painting. So first thing I did was I went to see what time the sun went down in St. Joe on the 3rd of April, because the train from the east was 2.5 hours late. It didn't get into St. Joe till 7:15. So the sun, as it turned out, had long set, and apparently, according to records from the time, everybody had gone home because they'd gotten tired of waiting. So there was no great big crowd on hand to see the rider off, and all the rider did in St. Joe was they walked the horse down to the riverbank, put it on a ferry over and took him to Elwood, Kansas. So he didn't need to gallop. But in memory, the sun is always shining, and there's always a big crowd on hand. It's that kind of memory. People love that memory. And I love that. I have a lot of affection for that kind of memory too. But it's that kind of story. Alexander Majors said, in additional answer to your question, he said they had 80 guys working for him. The way it worked was this. They weren't riding every day. A mochia of mail would leave St. Joe and head to Sacramento. They would change riders every 100 miles. And then another rider would leave Sacramento at the same time and go this way. We know that it was very tiring and exhausting, and we know, for instance, one guy fell asleep on the back of he was riding a mule. People rode mules in the West. They're very sure-footed. He fell asleep on the back of the mule, and the mule stopped, turned around, and walked back to the station from where they had departed. So we have someone's memory of that. That was actually in the state of Utah. Major's information is pretty accurate. I will say only one thing about that. Alexander Majors was a fascinating guy. He lived till 1900. That's amazing. He lived to see almost the whole 19th century. He was a very religious person. He read the Bible. He gave every rider of the Pony Express a Bible, and people love to tell you about that in the West. Thousands of Americans have that Bible in their home. But I always wondered, why would a man riding a horse night and day across America, when would he have time to study the Bible? But that's part of its legacy. Alexander Majors was bankrupt and broke and sick and had a lot of problems after the pony went out of business. He tried various things and they didn't work out. He wound up living in a shack in Denver, outside of Denver, in the it's about 1890-ish. And Buffalo Bill was in Denver. Now, Buffalo Bill had in fact worked for Majors when he was a boy as a courier, and that's his connection with the Pony Express. He just kind of enriched that story. It just got a little bit bigger. Bill Cody was only 11 years old when he was a courier for Alexander Majors. His father had died. His mother begged Majors to give the kid a job. This is in Kansas. So Cody was having dinner at this big hotel in Denver, and somebody said to him, "My God, I ran into this character the other day, real old-time character. You know, you don't see these guys anymore." He said he was full of crazy stories, and he told me, "I used to own the Pony Express." Well, Majors knew exactly who the old man was. I mean, Bill Cody knew exactly who the old man was. And Cody was a very decent person, really, a very generous person, very kind. So he went to see Majors, and he basically saved him. He basically adopted him for the last decade of his life and took care of him. The problem with this is this. He then hired a dime novelist, which is sort of a Louis L'Amour-like character, to write Majors' official autobiography, and in which Cody stars, okay? one of the problems with that is we can't be entirely sure what the heck is true. In fact, Majors said when he was an old man, he spoke at a thing in Omaha, Nebraska. He said, I no longer remember what's true. And I think that's a very, very touching kind of thing. Yes, sir, please.
How many riders were there?
Well, Majors tells us in his memoirs that they had 80 riders. I think that's plausible. Again, that's one of those things that you can actually look at as a kind of fact. I often tell people in looking at this story, it's a little like those 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzles that children used to put together on rainy afternoons. I guess they wouldn't do a thing like that now, but you remember when we had jigsaw puzzles? We don't have all the pieces, but we have enough pieces so we have some idea of what the heck it is. But it's that sort of thing, yeah. They didn't have a lot of money. In fact, one thing I should tell you, the firm, the Central Overland, California, and Pikes Peak Express Company, was known by its initials, COC and PP. And old-timers in the West said it meant clean out of cash and poor pay, because they were famous for not paying their bills. Famous for not paying their bills. Now, that's not... Yes, sir, please.
Two kind of related questions. One, you mentioned about the riders.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the transfer stations and who ran them and how they were
Right,
run?
thank you. Excellent question.
And the second thing, about the customers.
Yes.
Because it seemed to me that this is a pretty tumultuous period.
Yes.
You had an election of
Right,
Lincoln.
right.
You had
You did,
the,
right.
beginning of the Civil War.
Yes.
It seems to me that your profession,
Yes.
like the New York Times,
Yeah.
that would be
Exactly.
really-
Those are excellent questions. The second question is the kinds of people who were sending things via Pony Express were newspapers, the government, even the British Foreign Office used the Pony Express, for it was faster to send information across America on the back of a fast horse and then from ship to San Francisco to Hong Kong than it was the other way, believe it or not. Fast sailing time on the Pacific could be as little as 40 days if you had good wind. And the first part of your question was,
transfer.
yes,
stations.
the quality of the stations along the line was a little dicey, and that's why Richard Burton's descriptions are interesting. Some of these places were actual stables with people working there, and some places it was just a single guy with a fresh horse. It was all thrown together very quickly. They hadn't been in business any length of time at all, but the Paiute Indian War started, and we don't remember the Paiute Indian War very much, but the Paiute Indian War was a significant event in the American West. It stopped east-west travel for a period of months in the spring, summer, fall of 1860. People were terrified. The land between what today would be Salt Lake City and maybe Carson City, Nevada, which is about 600 miles, it was very dangerous to go out there. Richard Burton, who had seen a lot of wild stuff, said he never saw anything wilder than what the Paiute Indians might do to you if they caught you. So people were inclined to not make that trip. And that affected the Pony Express because, again, they lost money. This book is not an analysis of their finances, such as there's nothing to really base that on, but we know they were always losing money because you needed to move a certain amount of mail. And while their customers paid well, they didn't carry very much mail. Sometimes the lists that appeared in the newspaper saying so many dispatches had arrived from the east, maybe only 25 or 30 letters. And so the math on that would be very, very modest return. If you think about all those guys and all those horses and all those guys who are supposed to be feeding the horses and, you know. Interestingly, the gentleman, the question about who had actually ridden for the Pony Express, one of the most charming things about these old guys was they always remembered not getting paid. They didn't have stories about daring do and fighting their way through red savages and all that sort of dime novel stuff. They said, well, it was impossible to get paid or whatever. It was interesting what their memories were. The memory of the pony in the West today remains just as wild and charming. When you drive across Nebraska, and I've done it many times, I've driven from St. Joe to Sacramento and back 6-8 times. I wanted to have the countryside in my head when I wrote the book. In Nebraska, all along that highway, the interstate, are signs that say, next exit, authentic Pony Express station. Maybe you've seen these stations, yes. There's quite a number of them out there. All of those stations, with the exception of Fort Kearney, are on the north bank of the Platte River. Now, there was no settlement out there in 1860 and 61. The Union Pacific came through, and those were railroad towns. Gothenburg and Cozad are two of my favorite towns. those buildings were not Pony Express stations. Ask yourself this question: why would a man riding a horse in the middle of the night in January swim the Platte River if he didn't have to? He didn't do that. But in memory, folks out there, if you ask around enough, people will say, well, you know, back in 1936, the Kiwanis Club decided they needed a project, and they hauled this building in from some guy's ranch and set it up, and that's sort of where the Pony Express stations come from. But there's a lot of authentic Pony Express stations, and I'm only aware of a couple there. However, further out along the line, if you're interested in it, there are a tremendous number of Pony Express stations. Nevada and Utah is full of Pony Express stations. Marysville, Kansas has a wonderful Pony Express station. Gothenburg, Hanover, Kansas. There's a fabulous Pony Express station there. It looks like it's right out of Little House on the Prairie. So there are plenty of real things too. I don't want you to leave here thinking it's all a kind of, you know, nonsense. But yes, ma'am, please.
Did the ponies have to be black?
No, they didn't have to be black. No. That was just somebody's memory. And actually, they weren't actually ponies. Americans today tend to think of ponies. They think of Misty of Chincoteague, yes? These were not ponies. This is not like a pony ride for children at the fair. These were horses. These were good bloodstock horses, most of which had been brought from the East, because you need to put a guy on the back of a good horse. In fact, that takes us back to the matter of the Indians. The Indians would not have been averse to taking your horse away from you, and I don't say that disrespectfully, but they would have had to catch you. And if you were riding a good horse, that in fact would have been much better than to have a gun and to shoot. You know, it's also, some of you may know this, it's extremely difficult to accurately fire a gun, a handgun or a rifle off the back of a moving horse. In fact, it is almost impossible. But you see, in one of my favorite movies is The Pony Express with Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston plays Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill was 12 years old when the Pony Express began. Charlton Heston was 37 when they made the movie. He was all dressed up in buckskin. And he had, any of you know anything about guns? He had a Hawken rifle. That's the kind of rifle you use to shoot buffalo. It's like a blunderbuss. Old-timers in the West used a Hawken rifle, and they often would mount it on something. You know, you had to have it up on something because you'd knock yourself down on it. Heston's firing a Hawken rifle off the back of a horse. Now, no, that can't be done. Can't be done, but yes, yes, sir.
Could you tell a little bit more about the getting ready for it, that 2 months?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, the Russell, Majors and Waddell had this very successful freight hauling company, and they had made a great deal of money hauling freight to forts in the West. And this was a kind of crazy idea that they had. It was actually a little tiny offshoot of their business. They just thought they could try this. They started thinking about it, it would appear, from what little correspondence is available, in late 1859. But they were up and running on April 3rd, 1860, and it was a little bit catch as catch can. I mean, the whole thing got thrown together very quickly. I think they really believed somebody would come, figuratively speaking, riding to the rescue and bail them out financially, because a lot of people believed they were already in financial trouble when the thing began. And then I should also mention they were Confederate sympathizers, which did not endear them to the Lincoln administration, which is a whole other matter. But anyway, yes, please. Yes, sir.
2 questions. One's
Yeah.
a question, the other is more of a
Right.
expand. First, in the Paiute Indian War, it sounded like this group that went out to take care of the Indians, the civilians.
Yes.
They lost quite a few individuals in that.
Yes,
And
yes.
Was it like to the extent maybe of the, I can't remember what it was, but after Custer's last stand, in addition to that, there was a group of American soldiers that went out and lost about 60 men. Would this
Yeah.
be maybe number 3?
Yeah, it probably would. I mean, I'm not an authority on Indian wars. I can tell you this, Americans have a very funny way of remembering the Indian wars. That's an excellent question. I appreciate that. Wars in where the Indians won, we tend not to emphasize those in our when we reflect on the Indians. The Paiute Indians had just had enough. And the triggering mechanism for the Paiute Indian War was something as horrifying but as simple as that some miners at a place called Williams Station raped some Indian girls. and that was enough. The Indians had had enough. And the whites were very cocky, as they often were, and they rode up to where the Indians were. If you know Nevada at all, Pyramid Lake, up above Reno. They rode up there thinking they were going to have a Paiute for breakfast, is what the newspaper said. And they got up there. Winnemucca, whose name is still known in the West, there's a town named after him, was the chief. He was a great military tactician. He knew exactly what he was doing. He let them ride up into a box canyon. Come on up. And then they snapped it shut. Anyway, they took ferocious casualties. The newspaper accounts of the Paiute Indian War seem funny today because the exaggeration became almost astounding. By the time the story reached Sacramento, people believed that 10,000 wild red men were about to descend on Sacramento, and this, of course, was not ever the case. The Indians successfully defeated the whites at Pyramid Lake, and that was then the war continued more or less until the cavalry came in the summer and fall of 1860, in which they, the expression showing the flag, they showed the flag. They rode from Camp Floyd in Utah, which you may know is a famous military installation, to Carson City and back, basically to tell the Indians, we're here now. And the end of your question was?
Well, the other one's kind of separate.
Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit? Sir Richard Burton,
Oh, yes.
of Africa, Middle East,
exactly.
India.
Great.
I was amazed that he had written this book.
I recommend the book to you. It's in paper. You can get it, I think the University of Nebraska Press has it. It's a hilarious book because he's wildly opinionated. He hated Irishmen. So every page he has a joke or a derisive comment about Irish people. And I mean, having my grandparents came from Ireland, so I enjoyed reading his account. Anyway, pardon me.
That was pretty much,
Yeah.
well, kind of my question
Yeah.
was, everything he says in his book seems
Yes.
to contradict, again, the legend.
It does, in fact. I think it wouldn't be, the whole thing, the Pony Express is a little bit like Paul Revere's Ride. It's a little bit like Johnny Appleseed. It's a little bit like the Alamo and a little bit like Custer's Last Stand. It's one of those things that's rooted in fact and layered with 150 years of embellishment and fabrication and outright lies. And that doesn't make this story any less affectionate for me. I will just end, I'll take a couple quick questions, but I'll end by just saying this. The title of the book is Orphans Preferred, and there is not a gift shop in the American West along the 2,000-mile route of the Pony Express where you cannot buy an authentic Pony Express recruiting poster that always says, wanted, young, skinny, wiry men, boys, willing to risk death daily. And then it ends with, orphans preferred. People love that. I could never find that ad. I could never find it. I looked high and low. I went to the historical archives of 8 states, the Huntington Library, the Newberry in Chicago. It appears, and I end the book with this, to be made up by a guy named John Considine, who was a feature writer for Sunset Magazine in California, and he wrote a piece about the Pony Express, and they did in fact have ads in the paper looking for writers, but they didn't say orphans preferred. But they did in his story, and people loved that. You could make a good living selling orphans preferred posters, but the lady in the white, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you. 2 more questions, and yes, you had enough of me. Thank you. I don't blame you. I hear that a lot at home. Yes, the last question. Somebody else had a question? Yes, sir.
Are there any recreation rides these days?
There are, thank you. Every year, the National Pony Express Association reenacts the ride from St. Joe to Sacramento or from Sacramento to St. Joe. They switch off year to year. They do it in 10 days' time or less. It's fascinating to see them do it. And it's very, very moving. There is something about standing in a field or in the prairie in the West, and people will stand for hours and wait because they're not sure when the rider will come through. And then you see a guy like Mark Twain's description, the swift phantom of the desert, a little bit of a man in the distance coming, and it's quite amazing. People love that memory.
Have you done that?
Oh yeah, I haven't ridden. I have a lot of friends in the West who are in the horse business, but I'm not a rider. Although people have threatened, I have to go to Salt Lake next week because in the West they love this pony, and it's the end of the pony, so it's a big deal. But No, but I've watched a lot of riders, and I've watched it. You know, it's not an easy thing to do. A few years ago, in a reenactment, they in changing the saddlebags. This is it may seem silly, but in changing the saddlebags, the horse was spooked, and he got away from them, and he ran off with the mail, and it took him 8 hours to find him. I'm not kidding you. This was in near a place called South Pass in Wyoming. If you know, that's where Lewis and Clark, when they went up further, but it's where they used to say the rivers change direction. It's where you cross, and then suddenly they realized water was going toward the Pacific Ocean. Anyway, the South Pass is a very famous place. You couldn't cross the west through Colorado in those days. There were no passes. So you went up into Wyoming, which is actually quite easy to cross. So, last call. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, please. Sorry, yes. Yes, please.
You mentioned Colonel Fisher.
Yes.
You know, they said he couldn't really remember what was true, what
Yeah,
wasn't.
right.
Well, what was, in your opinion, what were some of the biggest kind of tall tales?
Well, part of Colonel Fisher made the Pony Express into a much bigger thing than it really was. There is no, and most of the books that came afterwards, and that's a good question, most of the books afterwards tended to do that. They tended to wildly romanticize the whole thing. They didn't acknowledge that it was a kind of madcap adventure, most people are astounded when you tell them it only lasted for 78 weeks. That it moved only roughly 36,000 pieces of mail. It only made 300 crossings, just slightly more than 300 crossings to the country. People don't remember those kinds of things at all. They tend to remember the more dramatic sort of stuff, the gun battles with the Indians. The colonel liked a gun battle with an Indian. He thought that was a good thing. He liked to tell a good story. You might find it interesting, if I might, by answering your question, that in the winter of 1912, a real true rider of the Purple Sage died in a cold water flat in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, named Robert Haslam. He was known in the American West. There's a whole chapter on him in the book called Pony Bob. Pony Bob was a great long-distance rider. He was an Englishman who had come out during the Mormon migration. He could change horses in 20 seconds. He was a terrific rider. At the end of his life, he was a greeter at a hotel. He was a kind of sad sort of figure. He was a real person. He wasn't some colonel story. The colonel, though, put a pretty good coat of paint on Bob Haslam's career. But he was the actual kind of character we associate with the Pony Express. And that's, I've often thought he would be, you won't ever see Bob Haslam in a movie, I don't think, unfortunately. Well, thank you for coming out to see an old man on a nice day. Thank you.